Hello, readers. What makes a good leader? Is it courage, wisdom, strength? Or is it the willingness to care for someone when everyone else is afraid? My guest today is Trevor B. Speesto, a writer whose love of history, storytelling, and the natural world comes together in his debut middle grade novel, The Tiger and the Crane. Set in China during the Qing Dynasty, the story follows Meng, a thoughtful young crane whose world is upended when he discovers an orphan tiger cub, just as his village prepares to choose its next leader. But beneath the adventure lies something deeper, a story about responsibility, belonging, grief, and the difficult choices we face when compassion and fear pulls us in different directions. In our conversation, Trevor shares how his fascination with history helped shape the world of the novel, why he wanted to explore leadership through a community of animals, and the personal experiences that found their way into Meng's journey. We'll also talk about mentors, self-doubt, the stories we inherit, and the question that quietly echoes throughout the book. What do we owe those who need us the most? Whether you're a young reader, an educator, a librarian, or someone who simply loves stories that stay with you long after the final page, I think you'll find there's something meaningful in this conversation. I'm Annisha Jeffries, and this is Reading in the Middle. Trevor, hi, welcome to Reading in the Middle. How are you today?
Good. Hi, Anisha. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here today.
I'm so excited to have you on the show. So, Trevor, I finished The Tiger and the Crane, and I found myself thinking less about the tiger and the crane than about a question that seems to sit underneath the entire story. And it's, what do we owe a stranger who needs us? Was that always something um the book you were writing? Was that always something in the book that you were writing, or did you discover that question along the way?
Well, when a real inspiration for the book, especially in terms of Xingfu, because like what you said, a stranger helping us, that would definitely be Meng, right? When he sees Xingfu help us there in the jungle, it's almost like a good Samaritan thing. But when I was writing the book, what was really important, like what I wanted to do, was that the book's for kids, and I wanted to make Xingfu a very relatable character for kids. And when I was creating the character, what was important was he was supposed to be the personification of someone feeling left out. And admittedly, right, unfortunately, kids could be cruel sometimes. Like we all know, bullying and whatnot's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And, a kid could feel left out for any reason. Whether maybe they feel left out because of their height or their size or their race or their religion, whatever. When I created the story, I really wanted to have a character that a kid could look at and say, "Oh, I felt that before too." And I felt like working with animal characters, having the village be wary of Zingfu because he's a tiger, it was vague enough for any kid can relate to Zingfu's feeling, right? Not no one in real life feels left out because they're a tiger, right?
Right.
Kids aren't going to relate to that, but they're going to relate to the feeling of feeling left out. And that's what I was really trying to create with Xingfu's side of the story. And with Meng's side of the story, he's focused more on becoming a leader,
Mm-hmm.
right? Something that maybe older audiences might connect to more, right?
Right.
Kids might connect to Xingfu more. And if you're an older person, say, if you're reading this as a bedtime story, if you're a teacher reading this to the class, that type of more of older reader might look at Meng's story and say, "Oh, I actually really relate to this guy."
Right. I agree. Now, Trevor, before we discuss the novel, I'd love to know about you as a reader.
Yeah,
What were the books that made you fall in love with storytelling when you were the same age as your readers?
Oh man. So I went to, growing up, in my elementary years, I went to school Sacred Heart. And when I was in Sacred Heart, we read a lot of good books. We read The Chronicles of Narnia. We read The Phantom Toll Booth. We read The Bridge of the Terabithia. But those were all books, that you're made to read in school.
Hmm.
And they're books that I loved. But when I first started reading on my own, one of the first things I fell in love with was the Calvin and Hobbes comic strip series by Bill Watterson. I love those comics, and that was the first time I really started to read on my own outside of the classroom, which is a huge step, because once you start doing that, then it could go anywhere. But obviously I have to thank school for introducing to me that I enjoyed reading, and then from there it was, there's things I could read outside of school. And I must have been like 8 years old, 9 years old when I was really getting into those stories and getting into those comic strips. That was the first time I realized that I enjoyed reading as a hobby.
Right.
And then from there, it picked up into, I was reading Harry Potter, I would read The Hunger Games. And then the first book that I really fell in love with was The Hobbit. I fell in love with the world. And I really liked that story of, I don't know, there was something about it that made it feel like I was reading like a bedtime story. I should be reading it at night, and almost like someone should be reading the story to me. Like there was such a strong voice in that book. And when I was writing The Tiger and the Crane, I was sort of picturing that sort of dynamic of a parent reading this to their child. And I think that really came in through with Chin Yang telling the story, right? It's the way the book's set up is that you're sitting around a campfire and this monkey is telling you a story, right? This elder of the village is telling you a story. So I really tried to capture that feeling of, sitting in your bed or sitting on a log around the fire, getting told something that's intriguing or engaging. A fun story.
Yeah, the opening chapter surprised me because the story begins with a community preparing for loss before we ever meet the tiger cub, and we're dealing with Master Guan's mortality. Why did you decide to start there?
Well, when you're writing a story, you never want to start at the beginning. That's what a lot of writers will tell you. They want you to start where the action starts. So you want to open up your story at a very pivotal moment. Because before Master Guan passed away, things were going pretty good, right? The hunters were a problem. But, you want to, because that's how you hook a reader, right? You don't want to start a story where it's, he woke up, he brushed his teeth, he's going about his day, right? You want to start the story where something actually happens. And obviously, someone like Master Guan, who was such a pillar of the community, leader of the village, her passing away, that's a really big deal. So it felt like that was a perfect place to start the story, because that's the perfect stepping stone into Meng learning about how to become a leader. It was, he didn't want to do it in the beginning. Uh, He starts to take that journey once the original leader is gone. He's kind of forced into it. So it felt like a good place to start because, it's a big deal. It's a loss, right? It brings people in, and it's a big deal for the village. So it's a good point in the story. It's a good spot to have the beginning, right? To see how the community is going to deal with this bigger event.
Yeah, because Master Guan spends years preparing Meng to lead, but she never gives him the confidence he thinks he needs. Instead, she gives him responsibility. Do you think confidence is overrated?
Oh, well, yeah. So it's definitely something that Meng needs to learn along the way, right? Because, like you said, he's not confident at all in the beginning. And Guan kind of tells him, well, you might not feel confident right now because you haven't done it. Maybe you don't have a reason to feel confident. But as you gain confidence by experience, right?
Mhm.
Because I think what a lot of people feel, and this was definitely something that Meng was feeling, is when he's pushed into the situation is, oh, I'm not ready. I'm not confident enough. I don't know if people are actually going to listen to me. Now, when Guan tells him, well, you're never going to be ready, whether you feel confident or not. You gain your confidence by being inexperienced. By tripping and falling and then learning and understanding and then, oh, wow, and wait, now I actually know what I'm talking about. I didn't before, and now I do. How do you build that? How do you build that confidence? It's, you got to start at zero,
Mhm.
you know? So I think it was natural for, it was a good arc for Mung to have from the beginning. I felt very natural for the character. When I knew he was gonna be making this big choice of, okay, he's gonna bring the tiger to the village. Where's the conflict if everyone is like, oh yeah, perfect? He needs to be not confident and then having the village kind of raise their voices against him. That creates the perfect conflict for a story, right? So he has to kind of build his confidence, right? That's not something that, I guess, story wise, it's something that I wanted Mung to earn along the way.
I
I knew
see.
that's where his arc was going to lead at the end, you know?
Hmm. And also, I liked that Mong Ku and King Jong don't just feel like three characters. They almost feel like three different approaches to leadership. Mong is compassionate, Ku is action oriented, and King Jang
Chin Yang.
Jing Yang understands. Sorry, so understands the
No,
power.
it's right. Listen, I know that the names are definitely difficult. That was something I was worried about when I was writing. I was like, that's why we kind of put that appendices in the beginning to say, because they're ethnically Chinese names, are authentic, and we wanted to keep that, but we were like, we're gonna have to help people out a little bit.
No, okay. I want to be respectful. I don't want to just mess it
Yeah.
up
No, it's all right.
because of the names, but and King Yang understands the power of story. Were you intentionally exploring different kinds of leadership?
Yeah, that's another thing I think that came naturally out of the story as I was writing, right? So when I was creating these characters and they were maybe going to be the pupils of who was going to come next after Guan,
Mm-hmm.
you kind of have to give them a reason why people would want them to be leader, right? Guan chose these characters for a reason, right? It's a pretty big village. There's a lot of animals. Why these three? So to your point, to what you just said, yeah, it was important to kind of give them very different leadership aspects, right? With Ku, right, like you said, like very action oriented. He's not one to sit back, right? And even him as the antagonist, we had to give him some redeemable qualities. But yeah, Meng is more. He thinks outside the box, right? That's a good quality of leadership. And we kind of tried to illustrate that. If you notice, he's the only one who wears clothes, right? He's the one who kind of brings the human stuff around. He'll get the fishing net or the fishing rod or the soccer ball. He kind of takes the human stuff and he's like, well, I could actually use these things. Everyone kind of looks at him and is like, oh, that's kind of weird, right? But that's his strength.
Right.
He's thinking outside the box that's other people aren't seeing, right? And then Chin Yang, we kind of tried to make him the mediator because obviously a big aspect of leadership we know is that the people who are below you, there's going to be fights sometimes. And if you're going to be a good leader, you kind of got to be the one to smooth things over. You want to be the person that people can rally around and try to encourage to talk things out.
Yeah, two things. Qing Yang understands that communities survive through stories that they tell about themselves. As a writer, do you think stories shape communities or simply reflect them?
Well, that's a good question. It almost seems like a chicken and the egg thing, you know? It's like, are we imitating, like when we write, are we imitating what we want society to be, or are we reflecting on what society is? It's an interesting question. I'm not sure. So it's funny. Chinyang's a really interesting character because by the end of the first draft, when my editors were looking at the story and they said, "Oh, he's a storyteller. He's leaving the history of the village," and I have a background as a history teacher, they said to me, "You're Chinyang. Like that's supposed to be you." And I was like, I was not thinking that when I wrote that, but maybe you're right. I'm like, maybe subconsciously I did do that, which is
Mhm.
weird, but I think, whether you're looking at it from a historical aspect or writing a story aspect, I think community you build off your history. In the story, right, Chin Yang has a line where he says, if you want to know where you're going, you kind of have an idea of where you've been. Right, that way a society isn't walking around in circles,
Right.
right? You kind of got to know where you've been already, you know. So that's the most important aspect I think about recording our story and recording our history is if we're wise enough and it's there for us to read, theoretically, right, we hope that we're able to maybe not repeat the mistakes of the past, right? As
Mhm.
humans, if we know anything from history, is that we struggle to learn from it a lot, right? We kind of repeat the same mistakes. But as long as we have history there to look back on, there's a hope that we can avoid the mistakes that we've already made, you know?
Mhm. I kept wondering whether the part where the tiger cub is really a character or whether he's a test. And every animal who encounters him reveals something about themselves. Was that also intentional?
That wasn't, I never really, that thought never really came across my mind, but I absolutely love that because it's so true.
Yeah.
As soon as you said that, I'm like, oh, wow, that clicks perfectly because, you know, if someone has fear, that's what they're showing towards Xingfu. It kind of shows like how they react to Xingfu is a reflection of who they are on the inside, and it's a kind of a response of, or because you can categorize Xingfu as the unknown, right?
Yes. Yes.
So when a character interacts with Xingfu, you kind of just get an idea of this is how a character is going to react when they're up against something that they don't know fully or they don't fully understand. It doesn't even have to be Xingfu. So that's a really good analogy. I hadn't thought of that, but that's absolutely true.
Yeah, I was thinking about that because with Meng's compassion, it actually costs him something. And that's what fascinated me. We often talk about kindness as if it's easy, but in your novel, kindness creates conflict, also risk and uncertainty. Why was it important to show compassion as something costly?
I think it really showed the struggles of being a leader, right? You got to imagine yourself in that position where, you have a really strong idea of what you think is right. And sometimes you might get pushback against that. And I think leaders of communities, right, whether it's politics or just even something small on a scale of like maybe a local business or like, being a leader of a school, whatever, there's got to be time. Like, how do you walk that fine line between not just going with what the mob says, right? Just because everyone gets angry, it's like, okay, I want to keep everyone happy. Because in a way, you're not always in a position as a leader to do that. You were meant to lead, which is
Right.
sometimes you have to, think. It's kind of like forcing someone to take their medicine, right? They don't want to do it. But you know that it's the best thing for them. So I felt like it was a very interesting place for Meng to go. Of like you said, his kindness costs him. He knows his way, and he believes it, right? He doesn't feel like he's lying to himself. He believes the kindness that he's going to give to this tiger. It's going to pay off in the end. But no, he has to go up against everyone saying, well, this is dangerous. And at the same time, he can't blame them. He can't blame them for their fear, right? He's like, well, he's a tiger. Like, I get it. But he has to stick to his guns too. And, walking that fine line, it could be a very difficult thing.
Mhm.
And what's always the kind thing? What's always the right thing? That's not always the popular thing. And that could be extremely difficult because for a lot of, when Meng first makes that choice, besides a few characters, right? Ching Yang is there with him. Puyi's there for him too, right? They agree with him. But for the most part, he's kind of standing alone in the beginning. And that could be extremely difficult.
Yeah, and fear is also fascinating in the book because it rarely announces itself as fear. Sometimes it looks like caution, sometimes it looks like practicality, and sometimes it even looks like wisdom. How do we know when we're being thoughtful and when we're simply being afraid?
Well, that's a good question. Well, yeah, fear is a very big aspect of the novel, because Ku knows that fear is a very strong emotion. Right? When people are afraid, they're willing to do irrational things, right? Safety is always paramount. And I think it's always a very interesting place to go, because then it begs the question, is survival selfish, right? If you're afraid, it's almost like an instinct of like, well, I'm trying to do this just to survive. But, as human beings, right, we have the capacity, and I know it's funny because there's a book about animals, right? But as human beings, right, we kind of have the capacity to see past that fear,
Right.
right?
Yes.
Because of our higher intelligence, right? Our higher emotional intelligence, right? I think what separates humans from animals is that we're kind of able to go against our instinct when we know that we feel that it's morally wrong, right? We kind of could still feel fear and say to ourselves, well, it kind of feels wrong that I feel that way, you know?
And right. And you mentioned humans. And I was going to ask, the hunters are terrifying because they barely seem aware of the destruction they leave behind. What interested you about telling the story from the animal's perspective rather than the humans?
Well, I think part of the whole animal aspect about it is that it came from the stories that I was inspired by, really. When I grew up I was born in 1994. So when I was growing up, I watched a lot of, the Disney movies, and two of my favorites, one was The Lion King. I love that movie.
Oh,
Still love
yes.
that movie.
Hmm.
And what I love about that movie is that it dealt with really mature themes that was presentable into a way for kids. And another movie that I loved, and this was on my grandmother, she had on cassette, and I would literally watch it over and over, and that was The Jungle Book.
Oh,
Another
yeah.
movie that I loved. And I loved the novel too. As I got older, I read the book. And I love that like style of story, like that animal perspective. Right? You felt like you were going on an adventure. Right? You felt like you were somewhere far away.
Hmm.
And I think that's really where the animal stuff came from, because I was inspired by those stories, and that's part of the reason why I chose China to set it. Because I wanted to write a story, something for kids. I felt like kids like animals, and it's a good opportunity for kids to learn about animals in the natural world. So you kind of get double points with that, right? You're giving them a good story, and then you're getting them interested in nature, which I think is always good. But
I agree. I agree.
yeah, and I chose China because, like I said, the stories I were inspired by, I simply just looked at them. I said, okay, well, The Lion King takes place in Africa. The Jungle Book takes place in India. What's another jungle area that I could take advantage of and kind of maybe introduce a cast of animal characters? And China made sense. I thought it was cool, right?
Right.
It gave that sense of adventure. And then when I went to college, I was a history major, and I think it was my junior year, I took a history of Middle Age China. And it took you from the Ming Dynasty, which is from like the 1360s, all the way up until the Qing Dynasty, which was the last dynasty before the Chinese Civil War, which was like, I think it fell in like 1911. And so when I learned that in school and in college about, the age of imperialism and things like that, I was like, you know, I could add so much more to the setting where I have this story, right? It doesn't just have to be, okay, it takes place in China. Let's place it in the 1800s, right? Let's give like historical hints of the time period that's taken in, right? Let's add that imperialism, right? Okay, right, there's hunters in our time now, right? There's poachers. But I
Hmm.
think giving that historical layer, I think it's something for kids and students to dive more into. Because, I love the idea of the historical backdrop of the book, because now that it's been introduced into some schools, what's really big in education right now, any education people watching, they'll know this, right? Interdisciplinary learning. It's really big right now.
Hmm.
And it's basically when you have something in English, and then you can kind of take it over into another humanities subject, like maybe history, right? So if students are learning about the age of imperialism in their history class, and then they read The Tiger and the Crane in English, their teachers might be able to coordinate and say, "Oh, you're reading that in English? are there things inside the novel, are there hints that the author gives you that makes you think, this is from that time period? I know because blah, 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 blah. I think it creates a really strong learning opportunity for students.
I agree. Educators are when you need to listen to this because this is a book that you want to share with your students. And Trevor, I want to ask you, like, what conversation would you most love to overhear between two young readers after they finish this book?
Yeah, so this is perfect because I recently got the opportunity to visit Sacred Heart where they read the book. Their sixth grade class had read it. Shout out to Miss Cecil. She was amazing. She's been teaching for over 20 years. And we actually have a free curriculum for the book, too. There's
Oh,
yes, there's free lessons on the book's website. Any teacher can download them, and, it's free. They just download the book, and there's lessons there, and they're completely editable. So the teacher can change it however they want. So,
nice.
as a teacher, I can tell you, right, there's nothing more frustrating than going to a professional development, getting a good source, and then it's like a PDF, and you're like, I can't change this, right? I have students that I need to kind of cater to their needs. You're not letting me do that, so it was very important to make those editable. But when I went to Sacred Heart, they had a really good conversation of, what's stronger? Is the truth stronger than fear? And I thought that was such an amazing conversation that they had because they saw it throughout the novel, right? Mung is trying to win through truth and earnesty, and Ku is trying to win through fear and manipulation. And the kids kind of had a debate in class on which one of those forces is stronger. And it was incredible. It was absolutely amazing to see for because, especially when the book's getting reviewed, right? The book has great reviews and it's all adults, right? So I'm
Right.
like, I would really like to know what kids think, right? What do they think about this? I know the adults like it, but, is it gripping for the kids? And, they were so into it and they were able to speak to the book's theme so well. I was so impressed. I was so impressed. And, a highlight for me, I just have to share this. A student compared Ku to Napoleon from Animal Farm. And the first thing I said to him was, you read Animal Farm? Oh, like, you read that book? This kid's like 12 years old. I'm like, this is amazing.
That is.
Yeah. And, so when I don't know if he read that in school or I don't know if he read that on his own, but if the kid's
Mhm.
making an outside connection with something else that he read in school, it's like, as a teacher, you cannot ask for more than that.
No,
That's like
you
a
can't.
grand slam, right?
Hmm.
So I think, the topics of truth and fear, and the kids they really hammered home the theme of forgiveness. One student was saying that it's interesting that Ku is obviously this big, strong tiger, but the strongest thing about him was that he was able to forgive the people who did him wrong, right? Especially
Right.
when he is the tiger, right? He has the power to go back and eat everybody. He's willingly choosing not to do that. And the students told me, they were like, that was the most impressive thing that he did. That was the strongest thing he did, was
Yes.
restraint and forgiveness when he had every right to be mean. And I thought that was, again, it was just amazing. It was amazing to hear the students go so in depth about it.
Yeah, it is different when you hear it from that lens, from students who've read your book, and you get the type of the discussion and that dialogue and comparison to another book. That must make you feel really great because when you're sitting writing the book, you don't know the impact that your book is going to have until,
Right.
you're talking to a class. So that's wonderful.
And you know what too? It's like, Animal Farm, it's probably one of the most famous books that have animal protagonists. So when I was writing the book, I naturally thought maybe a kid would compare it with this if they ever read it. People might, and then lo and behold, it happened. I was like, it's incredible.
Now, Trevor, was there a scene that you rewrote again and again because you knew it had to work emotionally?
Oh, yes, and honestly, I'd probably say because I'm writing something else right now, and I'm going actually through like the end of the first draft for it. I'm actually going through the same process. It's the ending. The ending you always have to land, and it's probably something I take the most time on because with any book, excuse me, because your entire novel is leading up to that point. I feel like when you write a book, It's kind of supposed to be like a roller coaster, right?
Right.
All the chapters, like if you have a 30 chapter book, chapters 1 to 26, right, is like you're just taking them up the hill. And then those last 3 or 4 chapters where you're reading and you're like, oh man, that's where I think I give the most detail. And that's, I think, where I spend the most time on any draft, because at that point, I'm writing that scene. I'm saying to myself, Trevor, you got to make it worth it for them. They spent all this time reading your book. You gotta make it juicy. You gotta make it a page turner at the end, because that is the book, right? Your last 2 or 3 chapters, like that's the book right there. So I think that's where I spend my most time. You got to make it thrilling, and you got to make sure that you have a very satisfying ending for your readers, so the reader doesn't feel like they wasted their time. Especially a kid, because a kid will tell you that the ending stinks.
Yeah, they will
They
tell you. Yes,
they will tell you, right? They have no filter. So if you're writing a kid's book, you're like, I got to make this good.
and it is a page turner from beginning, middle, and end. It really. I'm an adult, but reading it, I was captivated by the book, and I really enjoyed it. And listeners, educators, librarians, and even our young listeners, you really will enjoy this book, and you must get it. And I have another question. Many of our listeners that are young writers, what advice would you give someone who has a story inside them, but really isn't sure they're ready to tell it?
Oh, one thing I would say is that it doesn't matter if you are just beginning or if you are the greatest writer in the world. Your first draft is going to look bad. It's going to stink. And don't think that when you're trying to get those first words out, that it's
Mhm.
going to come out as Shakespeare, because it's not. But you can't let that discourage you. It is extremely difficult to create nothing into something, right? It's kind of like you're creating something out of clay, right? And you're shaping the clay once you have the words on the page. But when you're first creating nothing, right, you're creating just a splat of clay. When you have the blank page in front of you and you're first spitting out your words, it's not going to come out good. And it shouldn't, right? So don't let that discourage you. Don't let those first
Right.
words come out and you read it over and you're like, I'm not good at this. This kind of stinks. This doesn't look like the Hemingway, right, that I read. Like, do I stink? No, right? Everyone's first draft is looks messy, and that's the point. And you got to push through that, right?
Uh-huh.
Real writing comes when you're editing. That's when you really start writing, and that's when you really start shaping your story. But just get the words out first.
Great advice. That's great advice. You're right. The editing, don't try to be perfect, right? When you're writing
Right.
those, don't try to be perfect.
Get
That's not,
messy.
yeah,
Make
yes,
it terrible. Just get it out there. Then you can make it good later.
that's great. Okay, Trevor. So I know you've heard this, my podcast before, and you know what's coming up next, right?
Oh, what's that?
My rapid fire questions.
Okay. I'm
So,
ready.
so this is where I ask you a question, and whatever comes to mind, you answer it. It's just quick. I mean, you could take your time. I just like calling
Yeah.
it rapid fire. Are you ready?
I'm gonna try and stick to it. I'm gonna stick to the rapid fire. Let's see.
Okay, here we go. One word for Master Guan.
Wise.
What character would make the best podcast guest?
Mm,
Who secretly thinks they're right all the time?
Chin Yang. I say that because you said secretly. If you said openly, I would have said coup.
One word for Mung at the end.
Brave.
If you could spend one day in the village, who would you spend it with?
I think Chin Yang. I think he knows how to relax.
Nice, nice. Coffee, tea, or hot chocolate while writing?
Hot chocolate. I have a terrible stomach. If I drink coffee, it's like it ruins me for the whole day. So I'm definitely picking hot chocolate.
Music or silence?
Silence.
A middle grade book every kid should read.
Hmm. I really like Lord of the Flies. Again, I think that's a book that's like
Mhm.
mature, and it kind of shows them because it's kids too, right? There's kids main characters, and it gets
Mhm.
really serious at the end. And I
Yes.
think that it kind of shows them like, you have that power in you too, right? You got to restrain yourself, and I think it's a good story to kind of get kids to act more serious, I think.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And what's next, Trevor? What do you have next coming up?
So we have a Christmas poem coming out. We don't have a release date yet, but we should have one soon. It's gonna be coming out at the end of the year. It's called Flakenstein. It's going to be an illustrated Christmas poem. I'm really excited about it. The illustrations are being done by Rue Illisk. She lives up in Philadelphia. She's from Turkey. She's absolutely amazing. It's fun collaborating with someone deeper, right? Because the Tiger and the Crane, there was a few illustrations, but Monrex kind of handled that more with the illustrator. Now I almost feel like we're all working as a team, and that's been really fun.
Mm-hmm. All right.
Yeah.
So, Trevor, there is a question running quietly beneath every page of the novel, and it's not who becomes master, and it's not even what happens to the tiger cub. The question seems to be this: when fear and compassion collide, which one gets to decide who we become? After living with this story for years, how would you answer that question today?
I would say, I think always truth is always going to win out in the end. Compassion is always going to win out in the end, simply because compassion is honest, right? If people fake their compassion, you can tell there's an authenticity that comes with compassion when you really mean it, and I think that will always shine through over fear, right? Because there's always a hint of not having the full truth with fear, right? The truth always is going to come to light eventually. Truth doesn't have to make up a story, right? Fear kind of has to make up a story and a narrative, and you kind of have to go with it. And if you slip up, people could see through it and they'll say, well, you're telling me this, and that. I should be afraid. Well, it's kind of contrary to what I'm experiencing. With truth, you don't have to you don't have to stick to a script.
Mm-hmm.
It speaks to itself. It can't lie. So, I sometimes it takes a little longer, right? Sometimes it doesn't happen as fast as we would like it. But in the end, when all is said and done, you can't be compassionate. It's gonna, even if the person who's carrying it is smited down, what have you, someone's gonna pick it up, right? And
Right.
it's authentic.
Well, I have to say that after reading your book, I was just floored and enjoyed it very much. And listeners, you have to, I don't care what you do, go to your library, go to your independent bookstore. As I always say, it's very important. The
Yes, you can
Tiger,
order it anywhere. You can get
yep,
it from your independent
yes,
bookstore.
yep, bookstore, and it's called The Tiger and the Crane. And it's just a well written, wonderful book from beginning to end. And Trevor, I want to thank you so much for being on Reading in the Middle. This was a wonderful conversation.
Thank you for having me. I had so much fun. I hope we get to do this again someday in the future. I'd be happy to come back on.
Yes, you will, because I've had guests come back after they have written a book, and they've come back because I always like to have guests back on the show to talk about their work.
I'm looking forward to it.
Yay! My thanks to Trevor B. Speesto for joining me today on Reading in the Middle. One of the things that stayed with me after reading The Tiger and the Crane is that beneath the adventures, the talking animals, and the richly imagined world, this is a really good story about choices. It's wonderful. It's about what happens when we're asked to lead before we feel ready. It's about the people who believe in us before we believe in ourselves. And it's also about what we do when someone vulnerable needs our help, even when helping them feels risky. Through Mung, the tiger cub, Master Guan, and the entire village, Trevor reminds us that courage isn't always loud, leadership isn't always about being in charge, and compassion is often the hardest choice we can make. If you're looking for a middle grade novel that sparks conversation about community, belonging, responsibility, and what it means to do the right thing when the right thing isn't easy, The Tiger and the Crane deserves a place on your reading list. A special thank you to Trevor for sharing not only the story behind the book, but also the experiences, questions, and inspirations that helped shape it. If you enjoyed today's episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share this conversation with a reader, teacher, librarian, parent, or anyone who loves discovering great books. Until next time, remember what Master Guan taught Meng to do is to learn. Keep reading, keep asking questions, and keep finding yourselves in the pages of a good book. I'm Annisha Jeffries, and this has been Reading in the Middle.